Welcome to Sleepy Crimes. I am Anna, your host. Tonight, we drift into the shadows of the Banda Carbanak. Our story begins in the dying embers of 2013, in a city where the winter air does not just chill the skin, but seems to freeze the very breath in your lungs. We find ourselves in Kiev, Ukraine. The streets are paved with a thin, treacherous layer of black ice that reflects the pale glow of the street lamps like a dark, obsidian mirror. It is late, long after the city's pulse has slowed to a rhythmic, snowy crawl. Most of the residents are tucked away behind thick stone walls, seeking the warmth of heavy wool blankets and the soft hiss of steam radiators. But on a quiet corner, beneath a concrete overhang, a lone automated teller machine stands like a silent sentinel. Its screen cast a flickering, ghostly blue light onto the frosted pavement, humming with the low, electric vibration of a machine that never sleeps. It was here, in this frozen stillness, that the first crack in the world's financial fortress began to splinter. Imagine the scene through the eyes of a passing security guard, his boots crunching softly on the powdered snow. The air smells of wood smoke and the sharp, metallic tang of the cold. As he walks past the bank branch, he hears a sound that should not be there. It is the rhythmic, mechanical whirring of the cash dispenser. It is a dry, rolling sound, like the shuffling of a deck of cards held by a giant. He pauses, his breath curling in the air like a phantom. There is no one at the machine. No plastic card has been slid into the slot, and no trembling fingers have pressed the rubberized keys of the keypad. Yet as he watches, a stack of banknotes begins to emerge from the narrow mouth of the machine. They fall, one by one, into the metal tray with a soft, persistent thud. 10 notes. 20. 50. The machine is vomiting currency into the night, a silent jackpot blooming in the darkness. The guard's hand goes to his radio, his fingers clumsy in his thick leather gloves. He assumes it is a glitch. A simple mechanical failure of gears and sensors, perhaps brought on by the brutal Ukrainian frost. Inside the bank's headquarters, the following morning, the atmosphere was thick with a different kind of cold. The office smelled of stale coffee and the ozone scent of overworked servers. Bank technicians sat in front of glowing monitors, their eyes strained and bloodshot. They pored over the logs of the previous night, looking for the physical signature of a robbery. They expected to see evidence of a crowbar or a thermal lance, or perhaps a black box device hacked into the machine's exterior. But the logs were unnervingly clean. To the bank's internal systems, the withdrawal appeared perfectly legitimate, as if the machine had simply decided, of its own volition, to empty its belly. The engineers checked for the common malware of the time, a strain known as Tupkin, which required physical access to the machine. They looked for the telltale signs of a broken seal or a manipulated hard drive. They found nothing. The machine's hardware was pristine. The mechanical heart of the teller was beating exactly as it was designed to. It was then that the realization began to settle like a heavy fog in the room. This was not a mechanical failure. It was something far more sophisticated, a spectral presence that had somehow woven itself into the very fabric of the bank's internal network. The bank reached out to the experts at Kaspersky Lab, bringing in researchers like Sergei Golovanov to peel back the layers of this digital mystery. Sergei arrived in a Kiev gripped by the deepening winter of December. He stepped into the server rooms where the air was kept at a precise, artificial chill to protect the humming processors. As he began his forensic investigation, he felt as though he were walking through a haunted house where the ghosts left no footprints. He examined the hard drives of the ATMs that had gone rogue, searching for a single line of malicious code. Initially, he found nothing. But then, he noticed something peculiar buried deep within the network settings. It was a strange, virtual private network configuration, a small anomaly where the netmask was set to 172.0.0.0. It was a tiny, almost invisible doorway left ajar. It was the first footprint of the ghost. He realized that the attackers had not hacked the ATM, they had hacked the bank itself. They were not outside the walls, hammering at the gate. They were already inside, sitting at the digital desks, watching the employees through their own security cameras and learning the secret language of the bank's internal soul. As the investigation deepened, the sheer audacity of the intrusion began to emerge. This was the work of the Banda Carbanak. They had spent months in the shadows, moving through the network with the patience of a predator. They had used spear-phishing emails, disguised as harmless administrative memos, to gain their first foothold. Once inside, they didn't just steal, they observed. They recorded video of the bank clerk's screens, watching as they authorized transfers and managed account balances. They learned exactly how the bank operated, better than the employees themselves did. When they triggered the Kiev jackpot, it was not a desperate act, but a carefully timed test of their power. They had turned the bank's own infrastructure into a weapon against itself. The silent, snowy streets of Kiev had played host to the birth of a new era of crime, where the vault was no longer a room made of steel and concrete, but a series of interconnected pulses of light. As Sergei sat in the quiet of the Kiev office, surrounded by the soft whir of fans, he knew that the money falling into the snow was only the beginning. The shadow was spreading, and the world of banking would never be truly quiet again. The air inside the bank offices in late 2013 was thick with the quiet, rhythmic hum of progress. In those final months of the year, the atmosphere was one of focused routine. Picture a gray afternoon in an industrial city where the sky is the color of wet slate, and the rain streaks the large plate glass windows in long, erratic lines. Inside, the climate is controlled, a steady and sterile warmth that smells faintly of ozone and expensive carpet cleaner. A lone employee sits at a mahogany desk, the surface cluttered with staplers, half-empty mugs of lukewarm coffee, and the soft glow of a dual-monitor setup. The light from the screens reflects in their eyes, a pale blue flicker that reveals the exhaustion of a long day. It is in this precise moment of mundane stillness, the space between one task and the next, that the Trojan horse arrives. It does not come with the sound of breaking glass or the heavy footfalls of a midnight intruder. Instead, it arrives as a soft notification, a small envelope icon appearing in the corner of a screen with a digital chime that is so familiar it has become invisible. This was the entry point for the group known as the Banda Carbanak. They did not need to pick a physical lock when they could simply ask a human being to open the door for them. The email was a masterpiece of deception, a craft known as spear phishing. Unlike the broad, clumsy scams of the early internet, this message was surgically targeted. It was addressed specifically to a mid-level administrator, perhaps a person whose name was harvested from a professional social network or a leaked internal directory. The subject line was boring, intentionally so. It read, audit report, or perhaps urgent policy update. It was designed to trigger a sense of duty rather than a sense of alarm. The attachment was a simple Microsoft Word document, a file type that travels through the servers of the world by the billions every single day. As the employee clicked the file, the computer paused for a fraction of a second, a heartbeat of hesitation that went unnoticed. Beneath the surface of the user interface, a hidden set of instructions, known as a macro, sprang to life. It exploited a tiny, overlooked crack in the software's code, vulnerabilities with names like 2012-0158 and 2013-3906. There were no warning lights. The antivirus software, usually so vigilant, remained silent as the code executed a quiet command to download a payload from a distant server. This was the Carbanak malware, a digital shadow that would soon grow to consume the entire institution. Once the Carbanak malware was nestled within the system, it began to behave like a living organism. It did not immediately begin to steal. It did not freeze the computer or demand a ransom. Instead, it focused on survival and invisibility. It copied itself into the deep, dark corners of the operating system, disguising its identity as a legitimate service host.exe file. It was a ghost in the machine, a silent tenant that paid no rent and left no footprints. The hackers, sitting in dimly lit rooms thousands of miles away, now had a window into the bank. They began to use a feature of the malware that was particularly chilling: video capture. Using a tool called FFmpeg, the criminals were able to record everything that happened on the employee's screen. They watched as the clerk typed out emails to their family, as they logged into internal databases, and as they carefully entered their unique, supposedly secure passwords. The hackers were no longer just intruders. They were voyeurs, students of the bank's most intimate secrets. They spent weeks, and then months, simply watching. They learned the rhythm of the office, the time of the morning coffee run, and the specific sequence of clicks required to authorize a multi-million-dollar transfer. They were becoming the very people they intended to rob. The infiltration was not limited to that single, lonely desk. Like a slow-moving ink stain on a white cloth, the infection began to spread laterally through the network. The hackers used the credentials they had harvested to leap from one computer to another, navigating the internal architecture of the bank with the ease of someone who had built it themselves. They were looking for the crown jewels, the computers of the system administrators, and the servers that controlled the bank's connections to the global financial network. They installed legitimate remote administration tools, like AMI Admin and Team Viewer, turning the bank's own security and maintenance software against itself. If a security technician happened to see these programs running, they might assume a colleague was performing a routine update. The brilliance of the Banda Carbanak lay in this camouflaged presence. They did not fight the system. They became the system. By the time they reached the core servers, they had infected hundreds of workstations across 30 different countries. They were now the invisible masters of a sprawling financial empire, waiting with the patience of a predator for the perfect moment to strike. They stayed in the systems for 2, 4, and sometimes up to 10 months before the first dollar was ever moved. Imagine the terrifying patience required for such a feat. Every day, the hackers would wake up and log into the bank's network as if they were reporting for a shift. They would watch the screen of a manager in Kiev, a teller in Moscow, or a technician in New York. They saw the flickering cursors, the spreadsheets full of numbers, and the mundane interactions of people who believed their world was secure. The hackers knew the names of the employees' children. They knew which managers were lax with their security protocols and which ones were meticulous. They were building a map of a digital fortress that had no physical walls, but was guarded by layers of encryption that they had already bypassed. The Trojan horse was no longer at the gate. It was in the dining hall, in the sleeping quarters, and in the treasury. $1 billion was now within their reach, not through force, but through the quiet, steady observation of 1,000 tiny human moments. The stage was set, the actors were in place, and the bank was entirely unaware that it was already hollowed out from the inside. The silence of the office remained, but the air was now heavy with the weight of an invisible, impending disaster that was only a single command away from reality. The air inside the bank offices felt thick and stale, a heavy mixture of recycled oxygen and the faint, ozone scent of humming electronics. It was 2013, and the transition from the bustling daylight hours to the hollow quiet of the evening was a ritual of shadow and sound. In these rooms, rows of monitors sat like dark, obsidian mirrors, reflecting the occasional flicker of a passing security guard's flashlight. But beneath the surface of the glass, something else was flickering, something far more patient. Within the delicate architecture of the internal servers, the Carbanak Gang had settled in, not as intruders who break and grab, but as silent, internal watchers. They did not rush to empty the vaults. Instead, they draped themselves over the network like a thin, invisible veil, waiting for the world to wake up and show them how the money truly moved. Every circuit and every line of code became a hidden vantage point, turning the very tools of the employees' trade into windows for the world's most disciplined voyeurs. When the sun began to pull itself over the horizon, casting long, pale fingers of light across the office carpets, the employees would arrive. You can almost hear the soft, rhythmic clicking of their heels on the tile and the sigh of heavy coats being hung on hooks. A clerk might settle into their chair, the fabric groaning slightly under their weight, and reach for a ceramic mug of coffee that sent a thin curl of steam into the air. They would press the power button on their computer, watching the screen glow to life with a soft, blue luminescence. They had no way of knowing that as soon as the desktop icons appeared, a small piece of software, a silent sentinel known as a remote access Trojan, was already waking up with them. Across the digital divide, in darkened rooms thousands of miles away, the hackers were settling in too. They were not looking for passwords yet. They were looking for the human element. They watched how the clerk moved their mouse, the slight hesitation before they clicked on a specific administrative portal, and the way their fingers danced across the keys to enter a routine authorization code. For 2 to 4 months, this silent surveillance continued with the dedication of a scholarly study. The hackers used specialized video recording tools to capture every single pixel of movement. Imagine a secret archive, filled with thousands of hours of footage showing nothing but the mundane daily tasks of bank administrators. The watchers studied the way the internal software behaved, the specific pop-up windows that appeared during a wire transfer, the color of the progress bars, and the exact wording of the confirmation prompts. They were learning the language of the bank's soul. They recorded the video feeds and sent them back to command and control servers, where they were viewed through a custom-built video player designed specifically to analyze these stolen lives. It was an eerie, digital pantomime. The hackers were becoming ghosts in the machine, practicing the rhythm of a legitimate transaction until they could perform it in their sleep. They knew which employees were diligent and which ones took shortcuts. They knew who stayed late and who left their terminal unlocked for a few minutes to grab a glass of water. Every detail was a stitch in the garment of their disguise. There is a profound, chilling intimacy in being watched for that long without your knowledge. The hackers knew the names of the employees, children from the photos pinned to their cubicles. They saw the personal emails sent during lunch breaks and the desktop wallpapers that changed with the seasons. But more importantly, they saw the flow of the bank's internal logic. They mapped the labyrinth of the financial network, identifying the system administrators who held the keys to the kingdom. By recording the screens of these high-level users, the Carbanak Gang learned how to navigate the most secure corners of the institution. They didn't need to bypass the security. They simply needed to become the people who were already authorized to be there. They watched as administrators performed maintenance on the automated teller machines, noting the commands used to check cash levels and the protocols for remote updates. They were no longer outsiders looking in. They were the very fabric of the bank's daily operation, waiting for the perfect moment to turn the system against itself. As the weeks turned into months, the mountain of data grew. The hackers had mastered the art of the internal watcher, achieving a level of familiarity that was almost supernatural. They could anticipate the bank's every move. They knew when the audits were scheduled and when the security teams were most likely to be distracted by routine updates. The patience required for this was immense, a cold, calculated restraint that separated the Carbanak Gang from every criminal group that had come before them. They were waiting for the shadows to align, for the exact moment when a fraudulent transaction would look so identical to a real one that no alarm would ever sound. Inside the quiet offices, the employees continued their work, unaware that every click of their mouse was a lesson for their future executioners. The stage was set, The actors had been studied, and the script of the heist had been written in the silent language of flickering screens and recorded keystrokes. The transition from observer to operator was only a heartbeat away, and when it happened, the world would realize that the greatest threat was already inside, watching through the very eyes of the institution. The borders of Eastern Europe were no longer enough to contain the ambition that hummed within the group. Like a single drop of ink falling into a glass of perfectly clear water, the influence of the Carbanak Gang began to spiral outward, staining the financial maps of over 30 different nations. By the time 2014 rolled into 2015, the infection had spread across the vast, dark expanses of the oceans. In the sterile, air-conditioned silence of server rooms in the United States, Germany, and China, the same invisible threads were being woven into the fabric of the global economy. You could almost feel the weight of those digital eyes watching through the screens, thousands of miles away from where the fingers actually touched the keys. In the financial heart of London, where the evening rain slicked the ancient cobblestones and a heavy fog clung to the windows of the great banks, the malware sat dormant. It was breathing in the slow, rhythmic pulse of the city's commerce. It was a patient predator, one that did not feel the need to rush. It waited for the precise moment when the internal systems were most vulnerable, learning the habits of the clerks, the timing of the security sweeps, and the exact sequence of the most lucrative transfers. From the high-rises of Hong Kong to the quiet, dignified banking districts of Norway and Brazil, the ripple was growing into a tidal wave, moving with a silence that was as terrifying as it was efficient. The Society for Worldwide Interbank Financial Telecommunication, known to the world simply as SWIFT, is often described as the very backbone of global finance. It is a secure, encrypted language spoken only by the world's most powerful institutions. To the Carbanak hackers, however, it was merely a bridge to be crossed. They did not need to break the bridge. They simply needed to learn how to walk across it without making a sound. As the group moved into the middle of 2015, their manipulation of the SWIFT network became a masterclass in digital deception. They would sit for weeks, and sometimes months, watching the authorized operators in places like Malaysia or Kuwait. They observed how the orders were phrased, how the authentication codes were entered with practiced ease, and how the digital handshakes were performed between banks. When they finally decided to move, it was not with the blunt force of a common thief. Instead, they whispered into the system. They created fraudulent instructions that looked, to any observer, like perfectly legitimate transfers between established partners. Hundreds of millions of dollars began to slip through these digital cracks, moving from the vaults of unsuspecting banks into the waiting darkness of shell accounts spread across the globe. Each transaction was a ghost, a sequence of ones and zeros that carried the lifeblood of the global economy into the pockets of the shadows. The destination for this stolen wealth was a labyrinth of e-payment systems and carefully constructed shell accounts. The gang utilized international networks to funnel the money through a series of rapid-fire transfers, making the trail nearly impossible for even the most skilled investigators to follow. Imagine a room in a quiet, nondescript apartment in a city you have never visited. The air inside is thick and heavy with the scent of stale coffee and the dry warmth of overtaxed electronics. On the glowing screens, a list of 250 different payment cards flickers in the dark. Each one is a vessel, a tiny digital cup waiting to be filled. The hackers would inflate the balances of existing accounts by just a few decimal points, hidden in the noise of millions of other transactions. Or they would create entirely new, temporary identities that existed only long enough to receive a transfer of several $1 million. These funds would then be fractured, split into smaller, less suspicious amounts, and sent hurtling toward accounts in places like the Czech Republic, Estonia, and Spain. The incredible speed of the modern financial world was their greatest ally. By the time a bank in Canada or India realized that $10 million had vanished, The money had already been laundered through 3 different continents and converted into a dozen different currencies. It was a billion-dollar ripple that left no foam on the shore, only a cold, empty space where the numbers used to be. But the digital theft eventually had to touch the physical world. This was where the humans known as mules came into the picture, individuals hired through the lawless corners of the dark web or through existing criminal networks like the Moldavian Mafia. In the early hours of the morning, when the streets of cities like Moscow, Berlin, or Paris were at their most desolate, a lone figure would approach an automated teller machine. There would be no card, no PIN entered, and no outward sign of a robbery in progress. Instead, at a pre-programmed moment, the machine would simply begin to cough. The heavy, metallic clicking of the internal gears would echo in the sharp silence of the alcove as the machine voluntarily spat out thousands of rubles, euros, or dollars. The mule would simply stand there, the cold wind biting at their collar, and catch the cascading paper as it fell. It was a scene repeated in dozens of countries simultaneously, a synchronized performance of theft. In some instances, a single bank would lose over $7 million in a single night, as its entire fleet of machines was commanded to empty their guts into the waiting bags of strangers. These people were the hands of the monster, the final link in a chain that started with a single, deceptive email and ended with a suitcase full of cash in a damp, forgotten alleyway. When the true scale of the operation finally began to emerge into the light, the numbers were staggering. It was not just a handful of banks or a single region. It was over 100 financial institutions worldwide that had been hollowed out from the inside. The total losses were climbing toward the unimaginable sum of $1 billion. This was no longer just a series of clever heists. It was a fundamental breach of trust in the systems that governed the modern world. Investigators from international agencies, working alongside private security firms, began to see the patterns, but the sheer complexity of the billion-dollar ripple made it a monster that was incredibly hard to grasp. The gang had evolved into something more than just a group of hackers. They had become a multinational corporation of crime, with their own recruitment divisions and their own secret research and development wings. As the sun set on the financial districts of the world, from the glass skyscrapers of New York to the bustling, neon-lit streets of Taiwan, the hum of the servers continued unabated. Inside those machines, the Carbanak malware remained, a silent, invisible passenger on the global network. It sat there in the dark, waiting for the next instruction, the next account, and the next chance to turn the world's tangible wealth into a digital ghost that could never be caught. The air inside the European Cybercrime Center in The Hague was always a few degrees cooler than the world outside. Through the thick glass of the windows, the gray sky over the Netherlands seemed to press inward, heavy with the promise of a cold, persistent rain. Inside, the only sound was the low, rhythmic hum of servers, a sound that felt like the heartbeat of a hidden world. Investigators sat in rows of darkened offices, their faces illuminated by the pale, flickering blue light of multiple monitors. On those screens, the staggering scale of the theft began to resolve into a single, terrifying shape. It was 2014, and the digital breadcrumbs were finally beginning to tell a story. For months, the trail had been cold, a series of seemingly unrelated incidents scattered across the globe like broken glass. But as the researchers from private firms joined forces with the reach of the law, the fog began to lift. They weren't looking for a ghost anymore. They were looking for a guild. The first true breakthrough was born from a mistake so small it could have been overlooked 1,000 times. During a routine forensic sweep of a bank in Ukraine, a researcher noticed something out of place in the virtual private network configurations. It was a single line of code, a specific netmask set to 172.0.0.0.0. It was a fingerprint, a subtle imperfection in the craftsmanship of the malware that shouldn't have been there. This tiny error acted like a beacon in the dark. When they compared this specific signature to other breaches, the connections flared to life on their maps. The same fingerprints appeared in Russia, then in the United States, then across Germany and China. It was a moment of profound realization. These weren't isolated attacks by lone hackers. This was a coordinated, industrial-scale operation. The investigators began to feel the weight of what they were up against. Every time they peeled back a layer of the code, they found more evidence of a professional hierarchy. It was as if they were exploring an abandoned house, only to realize the owners were still inside, hiding in the shadows, watching their every move. As the investigators dug deeper into the compromised servers, they found something that chilled them to the bone. The hackers hadn't just stolen data. They had installed a window into the very souls of the banks they targeted. They found archives of video recordings, hundreds of hours of footage taken from the internal webcams of bank employees. In the silence of the research lab, the investigators watched as bank tellers in distant cities sipped their morning coffee, adjusted their ties, and processed transactions, completely unaware that eyes from thousands of miles away were watching their every keystroke. The hackers were students of human routine. They spent months, sometimes up to 4 months, just observing. They learned the cadence of a manager's day, the specific time the janitor walked past the vault, and the exact sequence of buttons pushed to authorize a multi-million-dollar transfer. It was a psychological haunting. The breadcrumbs weren't just bits of data. They were the echoes of lives being mimicked and then discarded. The investigators realized they were tracking a predator that didn't just break in, it moved in and became part of the family. Following the money proved to be a journey through a labyrinth of shadows. The digital thefts were converted into physical reality through an intricate web of money mules. In the dead of night, in cities like Bucharest and Moscow, silent figures would approach automated teller machines. These machines, triggered by a remote command from a server in a different country, would suddenly begin to spit out stacks of local currency. There was no card used, no PIN entered, just the sound of the internal gears whirring and the crisp rustle of paper as thousands of dollars fell into waiting hands. The investigators tracked these movements, noticing the influence of organized crime groups from Moldova and Russia. But the trail didn't stop at the ATM. The cash was funneled into a sophisticated laundering machine. It moved into the world of cryptocurrency, where the gang accumulated a staggering 15,000 Bitcoin. They used prepaid cards linked to these digital wallets to buy the finery of a legitimate life. Sleek luxury cars that smelled of expensive leather and sprawling villas on the coast of Spain. The breadcrumbs were turning into a golden path, leading the authorities away from the cold server rooms and toward the sun-drenched shores of the Mediterranean. The complexity of the investigation required a level of international cooperation that had rarely been seen before. The Federal Bureau of Investigation in America, Europol, and authorities from Romania, Belarus, and Taiwan began to weave their findings together into a single tapestry. They discovered a front company called Combine Security, a fake cybersecurity firm that the gang used as a cover to recruit the brightest young coders, promising them legitimate work while drawing them into a global conspiracy. The investigators shared thousands of indicators of compromise, tracking over 300 separate Internet Protocol addresses used by the group. They watched as the gang evolved, moving from their original malware to even more sophisticated tools like Cobalt Strike. Every update to the malware, every change in their laundering tactics, was a new thread for the authorities to pull. The tension in the investigation rooms was palpable. They knew they were close to the head of the snake. They could almost feel the heat of the Spanish sun as they tracked the final digital whispers back to a single mastermind who thought he was untouchable. The breadcrumbs had led them to the edge of the woods, and the light was finally beginning to break through the trees. in the gentle, sol-trimmed air of the Spanish coastal city of Alicante, where the Mediterranean Sea whispers secrets to the ancient stone of the shore, a man lived a life that was as quiet as it was deceptive. It was the spring of 2018, a year when the warmth of the sun seemed to mask the cold, digital chill of a global empire built on strings of code and stolen fortunes. Here, among the whitewashed buildings and the swaying palms, the man known to the world only as Denny's K lived as a ghost. He was the alleged mastermind behind a shadow organization that had redefined the very nature of the heist. While the world slept, his fingers had reached across oceans and borders, slipping into the most secure vaults of the digital age. He was a pioneer of the invisible, a phantom who had orchestrated a theft so vast it felt like a work of fiction. But the Spanish sun has a way of casting long shadows, and the light of justice was finally beginning to find the corners where he hid. The tranquility of his coastal retreat was about to be broken by the reality of a global manhunt that had finally closed its net. On a morning in March 2018, the air in Alicante was crisp and clear. The sunrise painted the sky in shades of bruised purple and soft orange. It was a time of day when the only sounds were the distant cry of gulls and the rhythmic pulsing of the waves against the harbor. But beneath this peace, a silent tension was coiling. Members of the Spanish National Police, working in a historic collaboration with the Federal Bureau of Investigation and Europol, moved through the streets like shadows. They were joined by authorities from Romania, Moldova, Belarus, and even Taiwan. This was the culmination of years of tracking a digital trail that had been designed to vanish. As they approached the mastermind's residence, the heavy scent of blooming jasmine hung in the air, sweet and cloying. There was no grand explosion, no cinematic chase. Instead, there was a quiet, firm knock on a door that had once seemed impassable. When the door opened, the digital ghost finally took on a physical form. The man who had commanded an invisible army was suddenly a solitary figure in the light of day, and the empire he had built on $1 billion was beginning to crumble into the Spanish dust. $1 billion. It is a number so large it loses its meaning, becoming a mountain of abstract wealth. To understand the scale of the Carbanak Group's success, one must imagine more than 100 financial institutions, scattered across 40 different countries, all being drained simultaneously by an unseen force. This was not a robbery of bags and masks. It was a slow, methodical siphoning. The group had infiltrated bank networks with the patience of a spider, watching for months, learning the rhythms of the employees and recording every keystroke. They saw what the tellers saw. They knew the secrets of the vault managers. When the time was right, they struck with a precision that was terrifying. In some cities, automated teller machines began to spit out cash at predetermined hours, as if by magic. Bundles of local currency would pile up on the pavement, waited for by silent couriers who disappeared into the night. In other instances, the group simply changed the numbers in a database. They would inflate a balance from 1,000 to 10,000, then transfer the $9,000 difference to their own accounts. To the victim, nothing seemed to have changed, but the heart of the bank had been hollowed out. The wealth they gathered was as ephemeral as the code that created it, but the mastermind sought to ground it in the physical world. Police investigators discovered that the stolen fortunes had been funneled into the world of cryptocurrency, a digital labyrinth where 15,000 bitcoins were allegedly amassed. At the time of the arrest, this hoard was valued at over $120 million. The ghost money was then laundered back into the sun-drenched reality of Spain. It bought luxury cars that hummed with expensive precision and sprawling houses with views of the sea. It bought jewelry that sparkled under the Spanish sun, hard and cold. But as the authorities searched the mastermind's home, they found more than just riches. They found the tools of the trade, computers that had served as the cockpit for a global crime wave, and documents that mapped out the next generation of attacks. The group had evolved from the early days of the Anunnaki malware to the more sophisticated Carbanak, and finally to the lethal Cobalt strike. They were always one step ahead, always refining their methods, until the very moment the handcuffs clicked shut on his wrists. The impact of the Carbanak group lingers today, a permanent scar on the face of global financial security. Their legacy is one of forced evolution. Banks across the world were compelled to rebuild their defenses, to recognize that the greatest threat no longer came from the street, but from the Ethernet cables in the walls. The investigation itself became a blueprint for the future of international law enforcement, proving that even a criminal organization spread across the globe could be brought down if the world worked together. Yet, even with the mastermind in custody, the shadow of the Cobalt Gang did not entirely disappear. Like a hydra, new heads emerged from the dark web, using the same tactics, the same cold logic, and the same invisible touch. The $1 billion stolen may never be fully recovered, drifting through the decentralized ether of the blockchain, a ghost fortune that continues to haunt the ledgers of the world. The story of the Carbanak Group is a reminder that in our connected world, the walls we build are only as strong as the code that protects them, and that the most dangerous predators are often those we never see. As we leave the son of Alicante behind, the image of those silent ATMs dispensing money into the dark remains. The digital empire has fallen, its architect is silent, and the waves of the Mediterranean continue to wash the shore, indifferent to the billions that moved through the air above them. The world of high-stakes cybercrime is a restless one, but for tonight, the chase is over. The servers are dark. The trails have gone cold. We can breathe in the stillness of the night, knowing that the ghosts of the network have been laid to rest. The case rests now. Let the details fade. You are safe. Close your eyes, breathe deeply, and have a good night. Sleep well.